Before the first soldier landed on Omaha Beach, the Allies had already invaded in Hitler's mind. Phantom armies massed in Kent. Inflatable tanks cast real shadows. Radio operators transmitted orders for divisions that didn't exist. General George Patton, the one commander Germans feared most, commanded an entire army group preparing to strike at Calais. German intelligence watched all of this, photographed it, intercepted the radio traffic and reported back to Berlin. The main invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais. It had to be Calais. Every piece of evidence pointed there, and every piece of evidence was a lie. This is the story of Operation Fortitude, the most successful military deception in history, a campaign of misdirection so complete that even after Allied forces were dying on Normandy beaches, Hitler still believed the real invasion was yet to come. The problem was obvious by 1943. The Allies would invade France. Everyone knew it. Stalin was demanding a second front. Churchill and Roosevelt had promised it. The only questions were when and where. Germany couldn't defend the entire Atlantic coast with equal strength. Hitler had to guess where the invasion would come. If he guessed right and concentrated his forces there, he could destroy the invasion on the beaches. If he guessed wrong, the Allies would establish a foothold that could never be dislodged. Everything depended on that guess. The Allies needed Hitler to guess wrong. The German High Command looked at maps and made the obvious calculation. Pas-de-Calais was the logical invasion point. It was the shortest distance across the English Channel, just 20 miles. Allied fighter aircraft could provide maximum air cover there. The ports were excellent. The route to Germany was direct. Calais made perfect military sense. German intelligence analyzed troop movements, aerial reconnaissance signals, intercepts. Everything confirmed the obvious. The main invasion would hit Calais. Secondary attacks might come elsewhere. Norway perhaps, or Normandy as a diversion, but the real assault would be at Calais. So Germany fortified Calais. The strongest defences, the best divisions, the most concentrated firepower. If the Allies came to Calais, they'd be slaughtered on the beaches. The Allied planners knew all of this. They knew what German intelligence was thinking. They knew what seemed logical to Hitler's generals. That's why they chose Normandy. Not despite it being less obvious, but because it was less obvious. Normandy was farther from England. The beaches were less ideal. There was only one major port, Cherbourg, and it was heavily defended. The bocage countryside behind the beaches was nightmare terrain for attackers. Normandy made less military sense than Calais. That's what made it perfect. If you could make the enemy believe you do the obvious thing, you could do the unexpected thing with impunity. The deception plan that became Operation Fortitude was born from this logic. Make Hitler believe the obvious. Confirm every assumption German intelligence was already making. Feed them information that fit their expectations. Build an entire phantom invasion force aimed at Calais. Make it so convincing that even when the real invasion came at Normandy, the Germans would think Normandy was the diversion. Keep the best German divisions sitting at Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. If it worked, the Allies could land at Normandy against weakened defences. If it failed, thousands would die on the beaches, and the invasion could collapse. The first requirement was creating an invasion force that German reconnaissance could observe. You can't just tell the enemy you have 1 million men ready to invade Calais. You have to show them. But the Allies didn't have 1 million spare soldiers to position in southeast England. Every available division was needed for the actual invasion. The solution was both elegant and absurd. Build a fake army. Not just pretend you have one, actually construct it. Physical evidence that German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph and German intelligence could analyze. This became the first United States Army group, FUSAG. On paper, FUSAG was massive multiple corps, dozens of divisions, hundreds of thousands of men. In reality, FUSAG was plywood and rubber. The Allies built entire fake camps in Kent and Essex. Inflatable tanks that looked real from the air. Dummy landing craft clustered in harbours. Fake fuel depots. Phony ammunition dumps. The props were surprisingly sophisticated. The tanks had to cast proper shadows. They had to be positioned realistically. The camps had to look lived in. German reconnaissance flights photographed all of it. The analysts in Berlin saw exactly what they expected to see: a massive force gathering opposite Calais. But physical props weren't enough. Armies generate enormous amounts of radio traffic units, communicating logistics, coordinating commanders, issuing orders. German signals intelligence was excellent. They could intercept and analyze Allied radio traffic. If Fusag was silent on the radio, German intelligence would become suspicious. So the Allies created fake radio traffic. Dedicated radio operators transmitted messages for units that didn't exist. Supply requisitions for phantom divisions. Movement orders for fake regiments. Personnel reports for imaginary battalions. The volume of traffic had to match what a real army group would generate. The content had to be convincing. Occasional security lapses had to occur. Messages sent in the clear that revealed sensitive information about Fusag's status and intentions. The radio deception was technically brilliant. The operators had to maintain consistent patterns. Each phantom unit had to have its own radio personality. The Allies studied how real units communicated and replicated it for their fictional ones. German signals intelligence intercepted this traffic and analyzed it. They plotted unit locations. They tracked movements. They built order of battle assessments. Everything confirmed that Fusag was real massive and preparing to strike Calais. Then there was Patton. George S. Patton. Patton was the most aggressive, successful Allied commander in the European theatre. The Germans knew his reputation from North Africa and Sicily. They feared him more than any other Allied general. German intelligence monitored his movements constantly. Where Patton went, the main effort would follow. So the Allies made Patton the commander of Fusag. They publicized his appointment. They had him visit the fake camps. They made sure German intelligence knew he was in southeast England preparing for the invasion. If Patton commanded Fusag must be the real invasion force. No way would the Allies waste their best general on a diversion. Patton hated it. He wanted to lead the real invasion, not play act with a phantom army. But he understood the strategic necessity. His presence at Fusag was worth divisions. The Germans would believe Fusag was real because Patton commanded it. That belief would keep German forces at Calais. That would save Allied lives in Normandy. So Patton did his job. He visited the fake installations. He gave speeches to non-existent troops. He allowed himself to be seen and photographed. He made himself the most visible, obvious piece of the deception. And it worked. German intelligence reported Patton is at Fusag. Fusag is at Calais. Therefore, the main invasion targets Calais. The deception had multiple layers. Fortitude South targeted Calais with Fusag. Fortitude North created a phantom threat to Norway, making Hitler keep divisions there that could have reinforced France. The Allies fed false information through double agents. German spies in Britain who'd been captured turned and were now sending disinformation back to their handlers. The Germans trusted these agents. Some had been reporting for years. The Allies carefully managed what information these agents sent. Too obvious, and the Germans would smell a trap. Too subtle, and they'd miss the point. The intelligence had to feel earned, discovered through the agents' own efforts, not handed to them. The double-cross system was one of Britain's greatest intelligence achievements. Every German agent in Britain had been identified and either arrested or turned. The ones who wouldn't cooperate were imprisoned or executed. The ones who would cooperate became tools of deception. They sent radio messages to Germany containing carefully crafted lies, mixed with enough truth to remain credible. They reported on troop movements. They'd observed movements of real units, mixed with reports of phantom ones. They passed along rumors they'd overheard about invasion plans. The Germans received a steady stream of intelligence that all pointed the same direction: Calais. One agent, codenamed Garbo, was particularly effective. Garbo was a Spaniard who'd convinced the Germans he'd built an extensive spy network across Britain. In reality, all his sub-agents were fictional. Garbo would report information from agents who didn't exist about units that were equally fictional. The Germans believed him completely. They paid him. They awarded him medals. They trusted his intelligence above nearly any other source. Garbo told them about Fusag. He told them about preparations at Calais. He told them Normandy was a diversion. After D-Day, when German commanders wanted to rush reinforcements to Normandy, Garbo sent urgent messages: "Don't fall for it. The main attack is still coming at Calais." Hitler believed him. Divisions stayed at Calais. The choice of Normandy itself was part of the deception's brilliance. It seemed less likely precisely because it was more difficult. German commanders looked at Normandy and saw the problems: longer crossing, worse beaches, limited port facilities. Why would the Allies choose Normandy when Calais was available? This logic worked perfectly for the deception. The Allies could present Normandy as secondary, while Calais remained the obvious main target. Even skeptical German officers would think surely the Allies wouldn't choose the harder objective when the easier one is available. But that's exactly what the Allies did, banking on the assumption that the Germans would see Normandy's difficulties as disqualifying rather than concealing. The planning for Normandy began in early 1943. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander. Montgomery would lead ground forces. The operational plan called for 5 beach landings: Utah, Omaha, Gold Juno Sword, followed by a rapid breakout before German reinforcements could contain the beachhead. Success required surprise and speed. The Allies needed to get ashore, secure the beaches, and push inland before the German army could bring its full weight to bear. Every hour that German divisions sat at Calais waiting for Fusag was an hour that Allied forces in Normandy could consolidate their position. The operational security was extraordinary. The invasion plans were among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Only a limited number of officers knew the actual target. Security measures were draconian. Letters home were censored. Personnel who knew sensitive information were restricted from traveling. The Allies couldn't risk a single leak that might alert the Germans. One careless comment, one compromised document, and the entire operation could fail. Thousands of men knew parts of the plan. Only a handful knew everything. The operational security had to work perfectly. One failure could destroy the deception. The Allies also manipulated physical evidence. They increased activity at ports opposite Calais. They reduced visible activity near Normandy staging areas. They timed reconnaissance flights so German intelligence would see what the Allies wanted them to see when they wanted them to see it. They controlled the narrative through carefully placed leaks, through double agents, through radio traffic, through physical evidence. Every piece of information the Germans received was shaped to support the same story: Calais is the target. The bombing campaign supported the deception. The Allies needed to destroy transportation networks and military installations in Normandy before the invasion. But bombing only Normandy would reveal the target, so they bombed Calais harder. For every bomb dropped near Normandy, 2 were dropped near Calais. The air campaign looked like preparation for an invasion at Calais, because it was designed to look that way. The destruction in Normandy was real and necessary. The destruction at Calais was excessive and intentional. German intelligence analysed the bombing patterns and concluded the main invasion will be at Calais. The bombing says so. June 6, 1944, just after midnight, Allied paratroopers began dropping behind Normandy beaches. At dawn, the naval bombardment began. Thousands of ships approached the French coast. Landing craft hit the beaches. The invasion of Normandy was underway. German commanders on the ground immediately requested reinforcements. The panzers at Calais were needed at Normandy. The response from higher command was hesitation. Was this the main invasion or a diversion? Intelligence said the main attack would come at Calais. Fusag hadn't moved yet. Patton was still in England. Maybe this was exactly what the intelligence predicted: a diversionary attack at Normandy before the real assault at Calais. Hitler himself intervened. He'd been asleep during the initial landings. His staff was reluctant to wake him. When he was finally briefed, he considered the situation. The intelligence all said Calais. His intuition said Calais. The Normandy attack seemed too small to be the main effort. He ordered the panzer divisions to remain at Calais. They would wait for the real invasion. That decision gave the Allies precious hours to establish their beachhead. Those hours made the difference between success and disaster. If the panzers had reached Normandy on June 6th, they might have thrown the invasion back into the sea. Instead, they sat at Calais waiting. The deception continued after D-Day. This was crucial. If the Germans realized immediately that Normandy was the only invasion, they'd rush everything to contain it. The Allies needed this deception to last days, ideally weeks. So Fusag remained threatening. Radio traffic continued. Patton stayed visible in England for several more days. The double agents sent messages. Normandy is the diversion, stay alert for the main attack. Garbo's messages after D-Day were particularly effective. He reported that his sources confirmed the real invasion was still coming. German High Command read these messages and hesitated. The Panzer divisions stayed at Calais for over a week after D-Day. That week was decisive. Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches. They captured territory. They brought in reinforcements and supplies. They established a position that couldn't be easily dislodged. By the time German High Command accepted that Normandy was the main invasion and began moving divisions from Calais, it was too late. The Allies were established. The war in France would still be long and bloody. The breakout from Normandy took weeks and the fighting was brutal, but the initial lodgment succeeded. That success was partly due to military execution and partly due to Operation Fortitude, keeping critical German forces in the wrong place at the wrong time. The genius of Fortitude was that it played to German expectations. The Allies didn't try to convince the Germans of something implausible. They convinced them of something that already made sense. Calais was the logical target. Any German officer looking at a map would conclude that Calais made the most sense. Fortitude didn't fight against that logic, it reinforced it. The deception provided evidence for conclusions German intelligence wanted to reach anyway. That's why it was so effective. The Germans weren't being fooled into believing something outlandish. They were being encouraged to believe what already seemed obvious. The scale of Fortitude was unprecedented. This wasn't a tactical deception for a single battle. This was a strategic deception that shaped the entire invasion. It involved thousands of people, the troops maintaining the fake camps, the radio operators sending phantom messages, the intelligence officers managing double agents, the air crews flying reconnaissance missions over fake installations. Everyone had to maintain the illusion. One mistake, one unconvincing detail, one suspicious pattern, and German intelligence might see through it. The discipline and coordination required were extraordinary. The technology was cutting edge for 1943 to 44. The inflatable tanks and aircraft had to be convincing in aerial photographs. The materials and construction techniques were sophisticated. The radio deception required understanding German signals, intelligence capabilities, and crafting traffic that would pass their analysis. The double agent system required psychological manipulation and careful information management. The Allies were using every tool available: technology, psychology, intelligence, tradecraft, operational security to maintain the deception. The cost of failure would have been catastrophic. If the deception failed, if the Germans concentrated forces at Normandy, the invasion could have been thrown back. Thousands of Allied soldiers would have died on the beaches. The war would have been prolonged. The political consequences would have been severe. Stalin would have had ammunition to claim the Western Allies weren't serious about opening a second front. British and American public opinion might have turned against further offensive operations. The entire strategic situation would have changed. Fortitude had to work. Failure wasn't acceptable. The success of Fortitude meant that when Allied forces hit the beaches on June 6th, they faced weakened defences. Not weak. The fighting was still horrific, particularly at Omaha Beach, but weaker than if Germany had concentrated everything at Normandy. The German response was slower than it should have been. Reinforcements were delayed. Command decisions were hesitant, all because Hitler and his generals believed the real invasion was coming at Calais. That belief, carefully cultivated through months of deception, gave the Allies the window they needed. The human cost of the invasion was still enormous. Over 10,000 Allied casualties on D-Day alone, thousands more in the weeks that followed. The bocage fighting was brutal. The Germans defended tenaciously, even without their full strength. But the casualties would have been worse without Fortitude. How many lives were saved by keeping German divisions at Calais impossible to quantify exactly, but certainly thousands. Every panzer division that stayed at Calais was a division that wasn't killing Allied soldiers at Normandy. Every delayed reinforcement was time for the beachhead to consolidate. Fortitude saved lives by misdirection. The irony is that some of the most important participants in D-Day never set foot in France. The radio operators broadcasting phantom messages from Fusag were as crucial as the soldiers landing on the beaches. The intelligence officers managing double agents were as important as the commanders planning the assault. The workers building inflatable tanks contributed as much as the real tank crews. War is often decided by people whose names never appear in history books doing work that seems peripheral but turns out to be central. Patton eventually got his real command. After the deception was no longer needed, he was given command of 3rd Army and led it with his characteristic aggression. But his time commanding Fusag, the Phantom Army, might have been his most important contribution to the war. By lending his reputation to the deception, by being the public face of the fake invasion, he tied down German forces that would have otherwise been free to counter the real invasion. Patton's ego took a hit. He wanted to lead the first wave, not arrive weeks later, but his effectiveness was actually enhanced by the deception role. The aftermath of Fortitude showed how completely the Germans had been fooled. After the war, interrogations of German officers revealed that many continued believing in Fusag even after the war ended. Some thought Fusag had been real, but held in reserve. Others thought it had been deployed elsewhere. The deception was so thorough that even in defeat, some German officers couldn't accept that the massive force at Calais had been a phantom. They'd seen the evidence, they'd read the intelligence, they'd made their decisions based on information that all pointed the same way. Accepting that all of it was deception meant accepting that they'd been completely manipulated. That was a difficult psychological adjustment. The intelligence lessons from Fortitude shaped post-war thinking. The operation demonstrated what could be achieved through coordinated deception. It showed that strategic deception was possible even against sophisticated intelligence services. It proved that human psychology, the tendency to see what you expect to see, could be exploited at scale. These lessons influence Cold War intelligence operations and continue to influence military deception doctrine today. Fortitude became the gold standard for strategic deception. The ethical questions around Fortitude are minimal compared to other wartime operations. This was pure military deception aimed at reducing casualties on both sides. Fooling Hitler into keeping divisions at Calais meant those divisions weren't dying at Normandy either. German soldiers sitting at Calais waiting for an invasion that never came survived the war. Allied soldiers facing weaker defences at Normandy had better survival odds. The deception saved lives across the board. It was a rare case where tactical trickery had unambiguously positive humanitarian effects. The planning and execution of Fortitude required trust across Allied command structures. British intelligence ran most of the double agents. American forces provided much of the material for the fake installations. Both nations had to coordinate their deception efforts, share information, and trust each other's operational security. The success of Fortitude was partly a success of Allied cooperation. If the British and Americans had been competing or withholding information, the deception couldn't have been maintained. Unity of effort made it possible. Operation Overlord succeeded for many reasons. Allied air superiority, naval supremacy, the courage of the assault troops, the planning and logistics. But it succeeded partly because Operation Fortitude convinced Hitler that the invasion would come somewhere else. That misdirection bought time. That time bought lives. That's the ultimate measure of Fortitude's success, not just that it fooled German intelligence, but that it gave Allied forces the opportunity they needed to establish the beachhead that would eventually lead to liberation of Europe. Before the first soldier landed on Omaha Beach, the war had already been partially won in Hitler's mind. He'd been convinced that the obvious target was the real target. He'd been fed information that confirmed his assumptions. He'd been deceived by an elaborate phantom that existed in reconnaissance photographs, radio intercepts and intelligence reports, but nowhere else. When reality finally arrived on June 6, 1944, Hitler was looking the wrong direction. That moment of misdirection, that strategic deception changed history. Operation Fortitude was the invasion that never happened, but shaped the invasion that did. The Phantom Army at Calais won a battle without firing a shot. The inflatable tanks and fake radio messages saved thousands of lives. The greatest deception in military history made the greatest invasion in military history possible. Hitler never saw it coming because he was too busy watching what the Allies wanted him to see.